Welcome to Side Chat. This week we are going to talk about the 20mm cannon. I know the past 2 or 3 months I did a series where I went through each nation individually and tried to run through the armament as a whole. You know, those podcasts were almost an hour apiece, and I was only talking about that nation's 20mm cannon individually. I thought it'd be a nice little refresher and kind of add in some more facts and just focus on the 20mm cannons themselves and see why it's so important to read that note card when it says Hispano 2 versus Hispano 5, MGFF, MGFFM versus MG151. What does that all mean? But I do encourage you to go back and listen to those original Armament podcasts. Those are full of really good stuff and a few really knowledgeable guests, more than I'll ever know. So real quickly, what defines a cannon? Why is a, let's call it the 50 cal, which is 12.7mm, known as a machine gun, and the 20mm is known as a cannon? Usually cannons are defined as any round larger than 20mm. There's some exceptions to that, but that's typically the basic rule. And two, you're going to see a lot of high explosive, incendiary, different types of acronyms attached to the end of every belt War Thunder. You know, high explosive, incendiary, high explosive penetration, high velocity, armor piercing. What that means is you have different types of rounds, and of course, if you shoot something with a 12mm cannon, just a piece of lead, it's going to hit it and cause a hole, just a piercing hole through that place. They learn very quickly when you put incendiary and explosive rounds, you do more damage. It's like a small frag grenade hitting the aircraft, and you can destroy more vital components instead of just piercing the aircraft skin. Now, early on, they had a bit of a problem though, because you had, those are used by fuses. Round strikes, fuse goes off, and it has, milliseconds. We're talking of it either exploding too soon or going all the way through and exploding. Every country fought with this a lot, and the British actually had quite a bit of problems early on with this stuff. And so a lot of countries used early on armor-piercing rounds just because they wouldn't fail. So let's start with Swiss. Yeah, the Swiss are actually, and I know there's no Swiss aircraft in War Thunder, so you're like, why the hell are we talking about Swiss? The Swiss had a gun called the Oerlikon FF, and I'm going to start here with the story, even though you can trace the Oerlikon FF back to another cannon. This is the first true aircraft cannon. I don't know if any of you, if you've never seen an Oerlikon FF in real life, they're massive, they're scary. You can't even, some of the Oerlikon FFs or the Hispano variants, you can't even cock by hand. You actually have to have a machine or a, almost a winch or a, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, a strap with a pulley to freaking yank that thing back. That's how hard it is to move the bolt on that thing. It's just huge cannon. So there's something to really respect how big these 20mm cannons really are. So we're going to start with basically there's 3 variants of the Oerlikons. There's FF, everything's called Oerlikon FF that we're going to talk about here. And then there's the FLS, so the FFF, the FFL, and the FFS. There was a little bit earlier version of the Oerlikon, but we're going to start with the FFF. So if the FFF, you have a 20x72 cartridge. Now, every round I'm going to list is going to be 20mm, and then the blast number is going to be by 72mm, and that's going to tell you how big that round is. So everything's going to be 20mm in that diameter, and then you have the other measurement of how long it was. So, we're going to start with the FFF, which was 20x72, which is actually one of the smaller rounds possible, and a decent rate of fire of 520 rounds per minute, and then it had fair muzzle velocity of 600 meters a second, and the gun weighed 24 kilograms. So it was a decent first time out. Then you had the FFL, which was an improvement on that, and that gun fired a 20x101 round. So that's much bigger. For some reason, the projectiles weighed the same. I don't know how they got that. The rate of fire was slightly less, muzzle velocity was higher, and the gun weighed 6 more kilograms. And then you had the FFS, which fired a 110mm round, so 9mm bigger. They just kept kind of getting bigger and bigger. Projectile weighed less, had a slower rate of fire, but had a much higher muzzle velocity, 80 meters a second faster. So that's the FFS. So how does that relate to War Thunder? Well, those 3 cannons basically made about 90% of the other cannons that you're going to see in the tech trees are licensed versions of this. And just to give you an idea, the FF, which means, like I said, wing mounted, it means Flügelfest. I'm going to butcher so many German words and Swiss words, I'm sorry. Which means wing mounted. The FFF is basically known as the original, the standard, and that was used for the Japanese Type 99-1 cannon. and then you had the MGFF was based off that for Germany. The FFL, the later redesign, is the Japanese 99-2 cannon, and then you have the FF-S, which is what the Hispano for France was based off, and then that's what the British based it off, and then the Americans based it off that, and then blah blah blah. So it's going to get quite messy quite quickly. So first we're going to focus on Germany. The Germans, okay, so take a step back from Oerlikon real quick. The Germans tried to make a cannon first, and they actually took what's called a C-30L, which was a flat cannon that they put on an HE-112 and tried to use it as a anti-tank gun, and it kind of worked. I think there was only a handful made. So you're going to see that playing in game. Other than that, it had a really horrible rate of fire. Give you an idea, it fired a 20 by 138 round, so that's huge. Projectile weight 134 grams, rate of fire 300 to 350 rounds per minute. So the Oerlikon FFS, which I said is pretty unacceptable rate of fire, was 470, and this thing's 350. Muzzle velocity was 950 meters a second, so that's pretty insane. That's actually going to be the fastest cannon I'm going to mention. But the gun weighed 64 kilograms. It's a poor little HE-112. It's never going to take off. It's just going to... I mean, yeah, I guess you're going to... Well, anyway, poor little plane. Let's just leave it at that. And then you had the MG-FF, which I mentioned is the based off the FFL Oerlikon. Try to stay with me. Those fired 20 by 80. That's going to be the standard round for the MG-FFs. And then the later cartridge used in the German tree, the MG-151, used a 20 by 82, so they're pretty close. We're talking like 1 gram of weight off the projectile weights. The biggest difference between those two cannons, the MGFF and the MG-151, is the MGFFs have a rate of fire of 530 rounds per minute. MG-151 is 700 to 750 rounds per minute. MGFF had the higher rate of fire, and it also, well, was quite heavy. But that's why the MG-151 and the later variants of the German aircraft replaced the MGFF. The other problem with the MGFF, since it was based on the Oerlikon FF, it could only use the 60-round drum mag. The Germans could never find a way around that reliably, and so they went with their Mauser MG-1, I believe it was Mauser who made that gun, MG-151. So right there, you know, whenever you see in the tech trees, you're going to see MGFF, and it's kind of a crappy early cannon. It kind of works. But then when you hit that jump to MG-151, it's huge, and it was huge in real life for the Germans. You're going to see another variant called MGFF/M. I'm going to butcher this word. I did it in the first podcast, and people told me how to say it, and then I'm so American, I speak English, I just forgot how to say it, so I'm going to entertain you guys again. Mein ShVAK, I don't know. Anyway, it's a round, it's a high explosive round. You'll see it in the tech tree when you pick your ammo belts. They basically made a really thin inner wall of their round and packed in as much high explosives because they're Germans and they figure out the most efficient way to explode stuff. So that's what MG-FFM, and those rounds were also used in the MG-151s and a bunch of other stuff too. So they you know, German efficiency. All right, we're gonna go to the Russians, who decided to not do anything Oerlikon. They're actually the only country that I think, yep, the only country on this list that have no Oerlikon roots. They built the ShVAK, and I explained the ShVAK early on in the Russian podcast. This thing was actually a pretty technological marvel. If you wonder why early tier Russians are so overwhelming, it's because they actually knew what the fuck they were doing. The problem is that they adopted later on in the war this whole stamp stuff out, you know, cheap guns, use it up, throw it away. Whereas the ShVAK was actually a technological marvel. It fired a bigger round than the Germans. It was a 20 by 99. The projectile is lighter. Has a rate of fire of 800 rounds per minute. Smoking. 750 muzzle velocity, so it's faster than the Germans had. And the gun weighed just about the same weight as the MG-151. The ShVAK 20mm and the MG-151, I would actually take the ShVAK 20mm over it if you look at it from a technical document standpoint. It was also very hard to make, and that's why the B-20 came out, which is basically the cheapest gun they could possibly make. Had the exact same stats, actually. They wanted a gun that performed just as the ShVAK, and they got it. The gun weighed a lot less, cost a lot cheaper. It wasn't made out of heat-treated steel, so it kind of warped as it heated up, and then they just threw it away. It's Russia. You know, stamp out 1,000,000 of them and throw 99,000 away. So, all right, let's move on to France, which isn't really in the game except for the the 520s or whatever. There's HS9, HS404. HS9 is based off of Oerlikon, like I mentioned, and then you had the HS404, which is a redesign, and this is something that I actually had to read up and learn about, a redesign of the Oerlikon FF. They actually found a way to make it gas operated, which was a huge technological jump, which is why the British and the Americans based their guns off this, because this was kind of a game changer for it. It was gas operated, which every decent automatic rifle in this world today is gas operated. There's a reason. Increased rate of fire, the lighter bolt, just a much better gun. And you'll see HS.404 throughout different tech trees. Early American guns will have it under license, or they just bought it from the British. You'll see French planes with it. You'll see the early British planes with it. So the British, of course, France fell, so the British continued development of that gun, and you'll see the Hispano Mark II, which is a magazine-fed 60 round 20mm cannon. All these guns use 20x110, by the way. I mean, all the stats on these things are really close. So it's 20x110, which is a pretty big round. 600 rounds per minute to 750 rounds per minute, depending on which variant. About 880 meters a second. So it was, the Hispanos are actually right there in the conversation here. But the Mark II, longer barreled, how do I say this? Drum magazine was its limitation, and they had a lot of problems with the guns in flight, which is why the British continued to use 303s next to it. Is sometimes the guns would actually get too cold, or they would come disconnected, or if they pulled high G churns, the guns would have problems. So that's why the 303s are still listed on every single early British plane. It's because they couldn't trust their Hispano Mark IIs. The Hispano Mark Vs are the evolution of that cannon, and they shortened down the barrels so that they're inside the wing for the most part. Higher rate of fire, less velocity, but that is their crown achievement, is that Hispano Mark V, which is why they used it on the Meteors and other early jets. Alright. Now let's jump to America, then we'll do Japan, and then we'll wrap this up. So, okay. So the U.S. early on bought and I'm going to bash my own country here for a bit. The U.S., we had some of the most legendary gun creators in the early 1900s, 1920, 1930, 1940, from Garand to Browning. There's some others, I just went blank, and I don't know why they didn't give this problem to any of them, the Army and the Navy. Sorry, the Army, and actually it's the Army, I believe, who tried to develop this thing, if I remember right. They tried to build the first one, which is called the A&M-1, is the British license of the HS-404, if I read my documents correctly. And that gun kind of worked-ish, but it was used on like the early P-39s and the very early P-38s. Well, they wanted to go to the A&M-2, which is the cannon game that you see on the BTD and the Corsair 1C. These things were almost deathly unreliable, and there's cases of Corsair 1Cs where one or two cannons will jam on the right wing, and then the cannons on the left wing still fire, and the plane would just do a roll and die, crash right into the ground. So that's why the Corsair 1C didn't see a lot of use in real life, was because the 20mm cannons were untrustworthy. They made 14 million rounds for this gun, and they did not have a reliable service weapon. Kind of a mess up there. Then they tried to make the A&M-3, which failed as well. The only reason you see the A&M-2 on like P-38s is because they were able to put a huge decocking mechanism to clear out the rounds. Basically, the main problem was that the U.S. got these cannons. They're like, we can make it better. We're going to make changes, make changes, make changes. It just made the problem worse, and you had an ineffective weapon. Most of the problem was that it wouldn't actually jam. It would be the hammer would strike the back of the primer, and it would be a light strike, and the round would actually not go off, so you had a live round stuck in your chamber. And it's not just like a rifle where you have a guy sitting there and yank it back and clear it. It's a 20mm can, like I mentioned. You need a machine to pull back that chamber to get that round out, and that's P-38 and Lockheed's genius, were able to get that problem fixed. But for most planes, it would not have been an option. Only reason it was on the P-38 was because Lockheed was behind design, and they had it in the nose. So, alright, let's wrap up with Japan. I mentioned that the Japanese Navy, the Type 99-1, Type 99-2 were based off the Oerlikon FFs. Somehow Japan fucked this up. They use the same cartridges, to my knowledge, but somehow the velocity is massively reduced. Their guns seem to be a bit heavier, and their rate of fire was significantly, or is actually a little bit faster. So, I guess they didn't follow the technical data, or they made some changes, so that's kind of why you see these. I don't know how they got, and if somebody out there can tell me, because I could not find documentation, why the hell is the Japanese cannon's velocity so low? Give you an idea, Type 91-1 fired at 525 meters a second, compared to, let's say, the Hispano at 880 meters a second. You know, over 350 meters a second slower. That's massive. Anyway, then the Type 99-2 was a bigger round, 20 by 101. It fired 750 meters a second. That's acceptable. So, Type 99-1, bad. Type 99-2, thumbs up. Then we get to the Japanese Army. This is a little bit more hard to explain, and it's hard to find any documentation, at least for me, because I googled the crap out of this stuff, and you just find bits and fragments, because the Japanese weren't very good at documentation, or they burned all the documentation, whichever happened first. HO-1, to my knowledge, was a flexible rifle, which means it could be used in aircraft or on the ground. It's like a 15-round, like, gravity-fed rifle, to my knowledge. If I'm wrong, please explain to me, but that's all I could find on it. And then the HO-3 was a mounted variation of that with a 50-round double drum mag. And that's what you'll see on the back of turrets. And then you have the HO-5, like I talked about in the Japanese podcast, which is a copy, and I don't think it was licensed, a copy of the Browning M3 or 1921 aircraft gun. So, you know, hopefully that clears up 20 millimeters. Early on, nobody could seem to get their hands or their head around how to make the best cannon, and I'd say the Germans and the Russians and the British got it, while the Americans and the Japanese kind of faltered and failed. And then you see some other variations of cannons. I'll run through them real quick. Pardon me. Browning made the 37mm. You'll see it called the M4. That's the cannon on the Air Cobra and King Cobras. That fired a heavy round at 680 grams, rate of fire 140 rounds per minute, velocity of 580 meters a second, so just a big, slow, heavy hitting round. Germans, you have the Mark 103, which fires a big, heavy 30mm cannon that was on the F8 video I just did, and the HS-129B2. Then the Mark 108 is a chopped down version of that. It uses a much smaller round, so that's why you see the differences in game between the Mark 103 and Mark 108. Mark 108 uses a smaller barrel, smaller round, higher rate of fire, but much lower velocity, and you know, so you got that going there. And then there's some other random stuff I'm not going to mention. I mentioned this before, and I'll say this again. The IL-10 came out recently, the IL-10 1946, and you have the normal IL-10. They both fire 23mm cannons. People are having problems understanding why the VYA-23s in the first IL-10 will blow up anything, and then the NS-23s and the IL-10 1946 do almost no damage. Difference being is that the VYA 23mm uses a 23 by 152, and the NS-23 uses a 23 by 115. There's a huge amount of, that's a huge difference. Velocity on the VYA is 880 meters a second. The NS-23's velocity is 690 meters a second. Same rate of fire. The NS-23 was picked because it was cheaper and it weighed a lot less. And then there's some variations of the NS-37 and NS-45, which were used in the Yak-9T and Yak-9K that we all love so much in game. There's the Japanese cannons, which I will not go through right now because they gave me a headache, and there's like 15, 20 of them. I did, like I said, refer back to the Japanese podcast for those. I did have all it listed. If there's any questions, and I guess I would do a kind of a quick refresher on the, what the hell, let's do it, right, we're here. Let's go with rifle caliber machine guns, alright? And that means anything smaller than 20mm. And I'll just run through this real quick. This is not going to be all of them. you had the Browning 30 cal M2. I fucked up earlier. So anyway, Browning 30 cal M2 machine gun, the 1921, fired a 7.262 by 63. And you could compare that to the Browning 303, which fired a by 56. The Browning 303, I'm sorry, the Browning 30, it's a little bit higher, much higher velocity, much higher rate of fire. It was just a better round over the British 303. Same thing with, I'm trying to look at the chart right here I have in front of me. It outperformed the MG17. There's a reason why Americans love their 1921. Yeah, it's a clear winner on this chart. Sorry. The ShVAK, actually, I shouldn't say that. The fucking ShVAK, the 7.62 by 54 ShVAK, fired 600 rounds per minute more. Same velocity. ShVAK wins. That's why early tier Russia is so dominant. I'll give them that. And then we have the Browning. Where is it? Browning 50 cals in here somewhere. Alright. 12.7 by 99, 750 rounds a minute, muzzle velocity 880. It is by far the fastest of that caliber that you will see. The closest one next to it is the Russian 12.7 by 108, but the American 50 cal flies a little bit faster. It's a smaller round. It has about the same rate of fire between the Russian UBS and the American 50 cal. Well, UBK, UBS are basically the same thing, so the Russians and the American 50 cals were by far the best. The German MG131 and MG151 had a faster rate of fire, but their velocity so variant. For some reason, the MG151 50mm has a just insane velocity and a decent rate of fire. I don't know why that was ditched so fast. I guess that was just made to make way for the 20mm to get the high explosive rounds in. But the MG151 50mm actually looked like a decent gun, which is probably why they used it for the base for the 20mm. And then you have the Breda-Safats, which I probably fucked that up too. Sorry, I'm gonna be yelled at for that. Was used. That's a 12.7 by 81. That was a much smaller round, lower rate of fire. The things about the Italians is they used really high explosive materials. I forgot what the hell it's called. They fucking love chemistry. And they made a really potent explosive. I forgot the chemical compound off the top of my head. That's in the German podcast. But you can see, each country tried to do their best, and I find this stuff kind of interesting. This is all ballistics, and so I, this is, and I'll say this and I'll wrap this up here. This is why I've always kind of stressed. This is why I do these podcasts where I talk about armament. Is it's not just the plane's rate of climb and turn rate and so on. Sometimes it actually matters what the hell your plane shoots out, and depending on what country it is, you get different options. And you will see why early tier British may be so-so. Early tier Americans are, pretty powerful. Early tier Russians are just, overwhelming. And same thing with the Japanese. Early tier Japanese are kind of underwhelming. And then as they got later, some countries got better, some countries got worse. And War Thunder is actually doing a decent job of trying to make this show and game, right? How, and it's a challenge. It's a whole nother type of game development, trying to make all these different ballistics and cannons and rate of fires and velocities and explosives and ammunitions all work in this game engine. And I know that we bitch about the Mark 108 not working and this and that, but there's so much to this. And I just want to real quickly give them some credit for actually trying to do this, because I've never seen a video game try with all these different nations to get all these different types of guns and ammunition belts working. And hopefully this is something they continue to strive for perfection in, because it's impressive. And it makes you and me as a gamer hopefully learn more about the history of the armament, the ammunition, and the design that went behind them. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I will catch you next week. Make sure I put the links in there as always. Twitter, Twitch. I'm trying to stream about one time a month now. I know I keep getting asked to Twitch more. It's just hard for me sometimes to sit down and get a decent block of time in a game that would be entertaining for all of us. And then also there's a Facebook page, which once in a while I'll just ask questions or share stuff, but I'm more active on Twitter. Also, there's something else. Oh, whatever. What the hell? I'll catch you next week.